In the moments before a plane crashes, a small, indestructible recording device called a black box captures the final seconds before disaster. These tragic recordings are as devastating as they are intriguing, and they offer us a glimpse into the horrifying reality these pilots face. What does the final moment before a plane crash sound like? Find out in this video as we take you through the most terrifying black box recordings in air crashes, starting with United Flight 93. United Flight 93. September 11, 2000 remains one of the most unforgettable days in American history. On this day, 19 hijackers from the terrorist group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 aircraft, resulting in one of the most haunting tragedies Americans have ever witnessed, a tragedy that still remains ingrained in our memories. However, the terrorists' mission wasn't a complete success, and that's thanks to the brave efforts of the passengers and crew aboard the United Airlines Flight 93. This Boeing 757 was supposed to hit the Capitol building, carrying out the same level of devastation witnessed in the Twin Towers, but eventually crashed into a forest in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. The black box recordings retrieved from the flight reveal the horrifying moments before the whole situation erupted into chaos. Hours before the incident happened, 4 terrorists boarded United Flight 93, which was originally headed from Newark International Airport in New Jersey to San Francisco International Airport in California. Ziad Jarrah, Saeed Al-Ghamdi, Ahmad Al-Haznawi, and Ahmed Al-Nami all boarded the plane, armed with explosives. With them were 37 innocent passengers, along with 7 crew members, who had no idea how bad the day would turn out. 46 minutes into the flight, the hijackers kicked their plans into overdrive, taking the life of 1 passenger while storming the cockpit to gain control of the aircraft. Left with no choice but to comply, Captain Jason Dahl and First Officer Leroy Homer Jr. surrendered the control of the plane to the hijackers, who had apparently undergone pilot training. That was when things took a turn for the worse. Unlike the other 3 planes that were hijacked, United Airlines Flight 93 was delayed for 42 minutes at the airport, so by the time the hijackers activated their plans, news of the Twin Tower bombing had reached the passengers and crew. The pilots had also been warned about an impending attack by the Aircraft Communication Addressing and Reporting System, or ACARS. However, since they were already airborne with the terrorists on board, it was too late. After a brief struggle, the cockpit was eventually breached around 9:20 a.m., and the pilot sent out these mayday calls to the operators on the ground as the plane dove 680 feet to the ground. After receiving the terrifying calls from the pilots, the operators tried contacting the flight again, but that was to no avail. Taking full control of the plane, the lead hijacker Ziad Jarrah made an announcement on the radio, informing the passengers that there was a bomb on board, while also imploring them to remain calm or face the consequences. Air traffic controllers on the ground were able to listen in on the whole exchange, since the pilot keyed the communication system while the hijackers were trying to get into the cockpit. A woman, believed to be flight attendant Debbie Walsh, could be heard struggling with the hijackers and pleading, "Please, please don't hurt me. I don't want to die." However, a few moments later, her voice was silenced, and one of the hijackers could be heard saying in Arabic, "Everything is fine. I finished." Several other passengers and crew on board also made their last phone calls in those moments, including flight attendant Cece Lyles, who called her husband around 9:47, informing him about what was going on. At this point, most of the passengers already knew how this would turn out, but they weren't willing to go down without a fight. After mustering the courage to face the attackers, some of the passengers and crew, led by a man named Todd Beamer, recited the Lord's Prayer and the 23rd Psalm before he uttered the chilling last words, "Are you guys ready? Okay, let's roll." Moments later, the hijacker crashed the plane into an empty field in Stony Creek, Pennsylvania, taking the lives of all 44 people on board, including the 4 hijackers. Beamer's iconic final words became a symbol of the American spirit in those dark days, and they remind us of the brave men and women who sacrificed their lives to save hundreds that could have been killed if the plane had reached the Capitol building. Japan Airlines Flight 123. The last time Japan witnessed a deadly plane crash was in 1985, when Japan Airlines Flight 123 crashed into a remote mountainside in the Gunma Prefecture, taking the lives of 505 passengers and 15 crew members. The disaster dealt a big blow on the Japanese aviation industry, and it remains the deadliest aircraft crash in the world. But what exactly happened that day? The recording retrieved from the plane's black box reveals the horrifying last minutes as the pilots battled for survival. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a losing battle. On August 12, 1985, Flight 123 was 12 minutes into its journey from Haneda Airport to Osaka when a sudden explosion ripped away the rear bulkhead of the plane. This massive explosion led to a chain reaction that broke the pilot's control, totally severing the hydraulic systems, which controlled the rudder, ailerons, and the control surfaces. Without these hydraulics, the massive Boeing 747 was more or less a paper aeroplane tossed around by the wind and completely unresponsive to the pilot's controls. For the next 32 minutes, Captain Masami Takama and his crew battled to keep the 747 airborne, hoping they could at least make an emergency landing somewhere somehow. With the controls rendered useless, they had to resort to using the engine thrust to ascend and descend so as to keep the plane level. Unfortunately, they could only do this for so long since the damage on the aircraft was way too severe. After a while, Japan Airline Flight 123 crash-landed into a ridge on Mount Osutaka, about 62 miles northwest of Tokyo. Of the 524 people on board, only 4 made it out alive. The other passengers and crew lost their lives, including the pilots. However, the number of survivors could have been much higher had the Japanese government taken the rescue operation seriously. Unfortunately, it took hours for emergency crews to finally reach the crash site, and by then, most of the survivors who didn't die on impact had already taken their last breaths, leaving only 4 lucky witnesses who went to hell and back. The incident attracted international attention, and upon further investigations, it was discovered that the crash had resulted from a faulty repair to the bulkhead 7 years earlier. Today, almost 40 years later, the incident still haunts the Japanese aviation industry, and most people back then just stopped flying altogether. The haunting sounds last heard from within the cockpit reveal the horrors those crew members and passengers faced in their last moments, and the bravery of the pilots who never gave up on the plane until the last moment. Polish Air Force Flight 101. The Smolensk air disaster remains one of the most devastating air crashes in Poland till date. In one single day, the nation lost its sitting president, the president of the Bank of Poland, as well as the majority of its political leaders in a plane crash. It was on April 10, 2010, when the then Polish president, Lech Kaczynski, along with his wife Maria, the former president of Poland in exile, Ryszard Kaczorowski, the chief of the Polish General Staff, and other senior members of the Polish military, traveled to Warsaw to commemorate the 70th anniversary of one of the Katyn massacre, a mass murder of Polish intellectuals, politicians, and military officers by the Soviets during World War II. But nothing could have prepared them for the twist that lurked around the corner. As the flight progressed, the crew became increasingly concerned about the terrible weather that day and even contemplated landing in an alternative airfield. However, since the plane was carrying some of the nation's most important personalities, the crew feared a negative reaction from these high-ranking officers if they failed to land at Smolensk North Airport. This former military base was the closest spot to the site of the massacre, although the airport had not been updated with the latest safety features at the time. At one point, the navigator could be heard saying, "He'll go crazy," a possible reference to President Lech Kaczynski's reaction should the trip be diverted. So they kept going in spite of the obvious danger. The captain even tried reaching out to the Yak-40, another aircraft that had landed in the airport earlier that day, inquiring about the weather conditions. The Yak-40 crew replied, "Well, generally it's absolute *T here. We were lucky to land at the last moment." Unfortunately, the Polish Air Force Flight 101 wasn't so lucky. With visibility less than 660 feet, the aircraft made its descent onto the runway. With no working system to guide the plane onto the ground, Polish Air Force Flight 101 eventually crashed into the trees, rolled, inverted, and crashed on the ground, killing all the 96 people on board instantly. The last words recorded by the black box are both haunting and disturbing. Air France 447. The mysterious disappearance of Air France Flight 447 over the mid-Atlantic on June 1, 2009 was a shocking turn of event that puzzled aviation experts for years. Following the devastating crash, secrets of the aircraft's last moments were lost at the bottom of the ocean until the black box was eventually recovered in April 2011. The recordings of this black box offered a rare glimpse into the terrifying reality of the passengers and crew as they dangled precariously on the edge of death. The man in charge of this momentous flight was 58-year-old Marc Dubois, a seasoned pilot with about 11,000 flying hours under his belt, including over 6,000 as a captain. Dubois's first officer was Pierre-Cédric Bonin, who also had an extensive flying experience of over 6,000 hours. However, this wealth of experience proved to be useless in the moments of disaster. As Air France Flight 447 traveled across the equator, it entered an area known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone, a place known for heavy thunderstorms that can reach over 60,000 feet, as well as various types of precipitation. The 216 passengers were oblivious to the dangers that surrounded them, but the pilot knew serious trouble was brewing, and things could go south at any moment. A few moments later, the two pilots began to feel a strange sense of warmth, and a weird smell permeated the cockpit. Based on their experience, the pilots realized it was likely the result of a large amount of ice and water being sucked into the engines. It didn't take long for the ice crystals to begin hammering on the Airbus A330, and then the autopilot and autothrottle disconnected, dropping the speed instantly from 275 knots to just 60. Shocked and dazed, the first officer tried to rectify the situation, but unfortunately, he overcorrected and climbed to 38,000 feet. That was when the plane began to stall. For the next couple of minutes, the pilots tried desperately to take control of the situation, but they only managed to turn the aircraft into a roller coaster of up and down pitches. At around 2:12 on that fateful day, the angle of attack broke 40 degrees, and since the engine could no longer produce the needed thrust, the plane began to shake violently as it fell out of the sky. 2 minutes later, the noise descended into silence as Air France 447 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. The final words of the co-pilots was of resignation, as if they knew there was nothing else they could do. At the end of the day, it turned out that it was the actions of the co-pilot that eventually doomed the aircraft. However, by the time this was discovered, it was already too late to remedy the situation. All 228 people aboard the aircraft lost their lives that day, and the aviation industry never remained the same. Delta Airlines Flight 1141. Unlike the tragedy of Flight 93, which was an act of terrorism, Delta Airlines Flight 1141 met its doom due to the unprofessional conduct of the pilots, who wasted the early phase of the flight on unnecessary conversations, resulting in a massive disaster. This haunting story takes us back to the morning of August 31st, 1988, when the Boeing 727 series aircraft suffered a malfunction during takeoff, resulting in several casualties. It was a simple domestic flight between Dallas, Texas and Salt Lake City, Utah. 101 passengers were on board the aircraft, along with 7 crew members. The flight was piloted by Captain Larry Lon Davis, with Flight Officer Kerry Wilson Kirkland at the helm of other affairs. As the aircraft prepared for takeoff, the captain and his assistant decided to neglect their essential checks and procedures and instead dabbled into unnecessary conversations, talking about what their CVR recording would sound like if they ever crashed. The valuable time that should have been spent making sure that the plane was good to go was wasted on talks about the dating habits of flight attendants, the upcoming presidential election, drink mixes, and various other distracting topics. Of the flight crew, the first officer, Kerry Wilson, was most actively engaged in the conversation, with the captain only occasionally joining in. The chit-chat would eventually cease as soon as the flight was cleared for takeoff, and at first everything seemed normal. However, due to the constant delay in their takeoff and the unnecessary conversations the crew engaged in, Captain Davis and Flight Officer Kirkland couldn't complete their taxi checklist, and this would eventually result in a massive tragedy. Owing to this negligence, the flaps were not set up correctly, and so the aircraft couldn't lift off at the regular speed. The aircraft's tail briefly made contact with the runway, and moments later, the right wingtip also struck the runway, sending the plane into a violent rolling motion. The aircraft remained airborne for only 400 feet before it dove straight for the ground, sliding sideways and leaving a trail of destruction 800 feet long. The black box recording captured the fear and trepidation in the heart of the captain and his first officer as the engine began to fail, and although they tried to remedy the situation, it was too late. The deadly crash and the ensuing fire claimed the lives of 14 people, leaving 76 others with serious injuries. Surprisingly, though, all members of the flight crew made it out alive, although they eventually lost their jobs. Subscriber's pick. Before we go on with the rest of the video, here's our subscriber's pick for today. The crash scene in the 2009 movie is one of the most haunting aircraft disasters ever portrayed. As the Plymouth Air Flight 74 descended in a fiery inferno, the final moments remained one of the most terrifying black box recordings in air crashes, and even though most people know it's a movie, there has been an undying theory that the crash scene was actually a real-life accident and not a cinematic recreation. This theory has managed to stay alive even after so many years, and many supporters of the theory have presented several pieces of evidence supporting the fact that those scenes were very real. What do you think? Let us know in the comments down below. Now let's get back to the more horrifying plane crashes. ValueJet Flight 592. May 11, 1996 was just another ordinary day at the Miami International Airport, but for the 110 passengers of ValueJet Flight 592, disaster was unfortunately looming. The flight, scheduled from Miami to Atlanta, departed after a 1-hour delay due to electrical problems. 10 minutes later, the plane crashed into the Everglades, ending the lives of every single person on board. But why did this perfectly fine aircraft suddenly crash mid-flight? To understand this case, we delve deep into the history of ValueJet itself. Born out of a desire to make air travel as cheap as possible, ValueJet Airlines was known for its unsafe practices and a lackluster approach to its aircraft maintenance. The aircraft used for this particular flight was a DC-932, which had previously been flown by Delta Airlines. However, the plane wasn't exactly in tip-top condition, as it had suffered a series of incidents in the 2 years before the crash. From aborted takeoffs to the 8 emergency landings, it seemed as though the plane was just a disaster waiting to happen. As the events unfolded on that fateful day, everything seemed normal at first. But then, around 2:10 p.m., the passengers began to smell smoke. Around the same time, the pilots also heard a loud bang in their headsets, and suddenly the plane started losing electrical power. Apparently, a fire had broken out in the cargo compartment, which was supposedly caused by mislabeled and improperly stored hazardous cargo. As the smoke filled the cockpit, the flight attendants opened the door only to find the passenger cabin engulfed in flames as the helpless passengers screamed, "Fire! Fire! Fire!" As recorded by the black box, the electrical and control system began to fail, and the fire spread further, totally consuming the floorboards and everything in its path. In the heat of the moment, the pilots tried steering back to a nearby airport, but it was a little too late. Just 10 seconds before impact, the pilot lost control, and the plane banked sharply, rolling onto its side and nosediving into the Francis S. Taylor Wildlife Management Area in the Everglades. All the 110 passengers and crew lost their lives, and the recording of the last moments in the cockpit is nothing short of horrifying. PSA Flight 182. The infamous PSA Flight 182 crash of 1978 is considered the deadliest aircraft disaster in California history, and for a while, it was even the deadliest in U.S. history. However, the most chilling part of the whole case would be the haunting last words of the captain captured in a black box recording. On September 25, 1978, Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 182 was on a scheduled trip from Sacramento to Los Angeles International Airport, and then onward to San Diego Airport, when it encountered another aircraft mid-air. It was just another day at the office for the Boeing 727-200, but then, a Cessna. 172 light aircraft appeared in the skies, right in its path. The Cessna aircraft was operating a training flight out the Montgomery Field of San Diego, with a student and an instructor on board. Flying conditions were good, the skies were clear, and visibility was at its best. As Flight 182 headed towards its final destination, it descended first to 11,000 feet, and then to 7,000 feet. As all of this was going on, the approach controller advised the pilot to be on the lookout since there was traffic in the area, to which the crew responded, "We're looking." Just 10 seconds later, the approach controller informed the crew once again that the Cessna was at their 12 o'clock, just 3 miles away, and the crew confirmed they had sight of the aircraft. Unfortunately, it was only a matter of seconds before the pilots would lose sight of the Cessna aircraft, setting them up for one of the most dangerous situations any pilot can find themselves in. Despite being unsure of the Cessna's position, Flight 182 began descending, at the same angle that the Cessna was ascending, and eventually, the wings of the Boeing 727 collided with the smaller plane, breaking it up immediately. Upon impact, Flight 182 began a shallow right descending turn as it went nose down into the ground. It eventually struck a house in the residential San Diego suburb of North Park, and the ensuing explosion and fire created a mushroom cloud that could be seen for miles. The crash was so severe that the engines, tail section, and landing gear were the only recognizable parts remaining of the aircraft, and at the end of the day, 144 people were left dead, including 7 residents on the ground. In those final moments, the captain uttered his infamous last words, "Ma, I love you." This remains one of the most terrifying black box recordings in air crashes. Delta Airline Flight 191. Back in August 1985, America was hit by another devastating plane crash, which claimed the lives of 137 people, leaving only 27 survivors. It was on August 2nd when terrible weather conditions took Delta Airline Flight 191 out of the skies. With such a tremendous force, it seemed like the plane was being pushed down by a mighty hand, according to the survivors. Just like many of the other crashes we talked about on this list, Delta Airlines Flight 191 started as a regular passenger flight, scheduled between Fort Lauderdale International Airport and Los Angeles International Airport. The aircraft in question was a Lockheed L-1011 Tristar-1 with over 20,000 flight hours and 11,186 takeoffs and landings. The crew was headed by 57-year-old Captain Edward N. Connors, Jr., known for his meticulous style and his strict adherence to company policies. However, before they took flight on the day, the pilots had read a weather report that said to expect widely scattered showers and thunderstorms, but the report wasn't really taking that seriously. Another dispatch also informed the pilots that there was an area of isolated thunderstorms over Oklahoma and northern Texas, and it was this thunderstorm that would eventually bring the plane down. After battling a heavy storm in the skies, the plane was just about to land at the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport when wind shear associated with a microburst from the thunderstorm caused it to come crashing down from 1,000 feet. The plane landed about 1 mile from the runway and then skied across the ground at over 200 miles per hour. He then struck light poles, a Toyota Celica, and 2 water tanks, taking the lives of 136 people, while 27 people made it out alive. Amazingly, 2 of these survivors had no injuries. The final recording on the CVR reveals how the situation went from 0 to 100 within a matter of seconds. United Airlines Flight 232. While flying from Stapleton International Airport in Denver, Colorado, to O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, United Airlines Flight 232 suffered a serious engine failure, which eventually sent it crash landing and taking the lives of over 100 passengers. 296 people were on that flight, all of whom believed that it was just going to be another routine flight. But as soon as the airplane climbed to 37,000 feet, the fan blade in engine number 2 suddenly shattered, exploded, and broke through the side of the engine. Some pieces of the fan blade cut through the horizontal stabilizers in the tail, as well as the 3 hydraulic lines for the control surfaces, leaving the aircraft without any flight controls. Within just seconds, the plane began to bank right and descend at an alarming speed. But the pilot and his co-pilot weren't willing to give up just yet. After trying unsuccessfully to gain altitude and level out, Captain Al Haynes discovered that the yoke had no effect on the roll angle of the aircraft, so he had to fly the plane using the throttle alone. To lose altitude, the pilot circled around multiple times before deciding to land in Sioux City, Iowa. However, as he approached the runway, the aircraft began to dip below the horizon, all while traveling at almost twice the normal landing speed. It was a recipe for disaster. As the proximity warning system came on, it became obvious there was nothing else to do, and within just a few seconds, the DC-10 aircraft hit the ground, exploding and flipping over. Owing to the impact, the plane's fuselage broke into 5 main parts before it finally came to a halt. By the time the smoke cleared, 112 people had lost their lives. However, thanks to the brave efforts of the pilots, who kept trying to save the plane until they couldn't, 184 people made it out of that crash alive. The incident remains one of the most unforgettable plane crashes in history, and the harrowing final sounds from the cockpit will send chills down anyone's spine. AeroPerú Flight 6. 03. AeroPerú Flight 6. 03 had flown regular trips from Miami International Airport to Arturo Merino Benitez International Airport in Chile for over 3 years before this incident, but on October 2, 1996, it took its final flight, and the world has never gotten over the final sounds heard from that cockpit. There were 70 people on the Boeing 757 that day, both passengers and crew members, and it was piloted by Captain Eric Schreiber Ladron de Guevara, a 58-year-old seasoned pilot with over 22,000 flight hours. It was night, and they were flying over water, and then the crew started noticing that their basic instruments were behaving strangely as they were getting contradictory serial emergency messages from the flight computer. The Boeing 757 also began to stall, adding to the rate of descent, while the computer incorrectly reported they were flying at 9,700 feet. Unfortunately, the plane's altitude was much lower than they assumed, and even though a Boeing 707 was sent to guide them out of the precarious situation, it was a little too late. In the final moments of this flight, you could hear panic in the voices of the pilots as they tried to pull the plane to a higher altitude. First, the wings impacted the water, then they briefly pulled up before being thrust right back into the Pacific Ocean. As the moment of disaster inched closer, the captain resigned to fate, and just before the computer system beeped "pull up," there was a heavy impact, and everything went silent. All 70 people aboard lost their lives that day, and it remains one of the biggest scandals to ever hit Boeing. Thank you for watching this video. See you in the next one.